Many things to talk about. It's impossible not to get involved in what's going on around the world, especially with this pandemic that now, as always, has become a part of a business opportunity. It's difficult to begin with somewhere here. As you can see, President Donald Trump has said that governors are fools, that they have to impose force, literally force, because the people are upset. And people don't have reasons to be upset about. According to Donald Trump, worldwide demonstrations are nothing but idiots that are going out in the streets to cause harm and to loot. And in the United States, the most important and the most, according to them, for the last, let's say, 50 years, since Richard Nixon, but way before that, we have to really get back to it. It's the most important democracy in the world, and Israel in the Middle East is the only democracy in the world, and all the democracies that we protect are the democracies that obey blindly what this supposedly democracy it's all about. Well, we need to talk about that because the COVID-19 has opened a lot of question marks. In this new generation, I'm talking about the 20-year-olds and even younger, 14, 16, that has been present in the manifestations all around the world, in London, England, many other places in England, Australia, of course the United States, and in Canada, because the people we just have enough of these awesome, amazing, historic lies, decade after decade, about democracy.
It's been more than 2 weeks since the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis sparked a global uprising in defense of Black lives. The protests seen in major cities, small towns across the U.S. show no sign of abating. As calls to defund the police grow, protesters are beginning to see results. Last weekend, the majority of Minneapolis City Council pledged to abolish the police department in Minneapolis. In New York, state lawmakers have voted to ban the use of chokeholds and repeal a law that shields the disciplinary records of police officers from the public. In Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti pledged to cut police funding by $150 million. Residents are now demanding he go much further. Well, for more on the significance of this moment in the history of policing in America, from slave patrols to the present day, we're joined by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, professor of history, race, and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He's the author of The Condemnation of Blackness.
Democracy is a word that is used and misused and abused by everybody that has the control over it.
But a domination that was always rooted in harnessing the labor power of people, not to exterminate or to exclude them altogether, but to ensure that their labor would be extracted for the purposes of work, and then everything else would be controlled, that their freedom would be constrained. And that story is the story of every group in every part of the country whose labor power was the most important contribution that they would make. Their civil liberties, their civil rights, their human rights, their humanity itself was optional, was secondary. Their right to political dissent was secondary. So you could look at Chinese immigrants in San Francisco in the 1880s and see the same story. You can look in Chicago in the midst of the labor upheavals of the 1890s with foreign-born immigrant whites demanding fair treatment in the workplace and see the same story. You can look at Texas and look and see the story of the Texas Rangers, which enforced literal white property theft of Tejano and Mexican descendant landowners, people who not only had once been part of Mexico before the Mexican Revolution and before the annexation of Mexico by the United States in 1848, but people who were law-abiding, respectable citizens in their communities. And white settlers showed up and essentially accused them of false crimes, criminalized them, and Texas Rangers enforced that. So across time, across space, and across groups, policing has a tortured history of being enforcers of various forms of domination.
And this is so interesting. Khalil, because you, before you were a Harvard professor, you were the head of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which was established by Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who was an African-American Puerto Rican, bringing together all of these different cultures. I'm wondering if you now can go back, as you have, talking about the history of police repression, and talk about the history of the resistance to it.
Yeah, so the resistance is fascinating because for every slave patrol was a individual or group of individuals who sought to subvert the system. And of course, the most famous of those who fought against it was Harriet Tubman. And while often we think of her as a kind of caricature person who stands outside of history, she embodied the earliest forms of resistance to the system itself, but also to challenging the very violent instruments of that system. We can look at the resistance of laborers who armed themselves to fight against private security and police officers at the gates of companies in various cities of Massachusetts in the 1870s, in steel country, in the Midwest. In the rise up of populist anti-capitalist organizing of socialist leaders in the turn of the 20th century, white workers and black workers, in some cases side by side, fought together to change the very understanding of their rights as economic beings and as citizens of this country. And most certainly we can look at northern cities as places where African Americans showed up beginning in World War I and completely transforming the understanding of work and citizenship in this nation by virtue of the Great Migration. And in time after time, instance after instance, African Americans demanded equality at the workplace, demanded equality in the homes, and they fought against white police and white citizens in that effort. We saw commissions beginning in really the 1890s around white police agencies focused on immigrants. And then we saw the same thing occur in the Great Migration period beginning in Chicago as a result of an anti-Black riot in 1919. These commissions came to the same conclusion over and over again. For over a century, from Chicago to the consent decree in Chicago in 2017 around the Laquan McDonald shooting, you have the arc of 100 years of history saying the same story, which is that some precipitating act of violence by a police officer is only the tip of the iceberg of a submerged story of hundreds, in some cases thousands of people being subject to various forms of everyday forms of abuse and trauma by the police. And that resistance in the form of those commissions is Black folks speaking to their condition. Of course, the Black Freedom Movement gave us the Black Panther Party and other radical groups that essentially centered police brutality as the key issue for securing Black dignity and citizenship in this country and other places. And they were subject to the full weight of the federal government in repressive tactics, including COINTELPRO and other mechanisms, including assassination, which in the most high-profile case killed Fred Hampton in 1969 in Chicago.
I want to turn to U.S. Attorney General William Barr, speaking Sunday on CBS Face the Nation, asked if he believes there's systemic racism in law enforcement. This is his response. William Barr.
I think there's racism in the United States still, but I don't think that the law enforcement system is systemically racist. I understand the distrust, however, of the African American community given the history in this country. I think we have to recognize that for most of our history, our institutions were explicitly racist. Since the 1960s, I think we've been in a phase of reforming our institutions and making sure that they're in sync with our laws and aren't fighting a rearguard action to impose inequities.
I don't think that the law enforcement system is systematically racist. Professor Muhammad, your response?
Well, I mean, I was actually more impressed with some of the concessions he made in that speech than this fine line he draws between individual rotten apples and the system itself. I'd like your listeners and viewers to think about this way. This would be the akin of saying that Americans' prisons are not built to dehumanize, given everything we know what goes on inside of them, despite the fact that people who show up to work every day are not necessarily evil people. That's the problem we're having around this conversation around policing. Policing as a system has been a system of control that sorts people and decides who gets to live and who gets to die with even the mere accusation of criminality.
And in order to have control over it, the only and the most important thing that you need to have or produce is capital. The capital has taken over the world, the capitalist system. Now, I'm not communist and I'm not, how do you say that? But we're going to see today some realities. Israel is pissed off. The people of Israel is pissed off because the government of Israel decided to use Raphael and the intelligence products that they have developed over the last 70 years in order to follow the people according to them that might have the symptoms or the disease that is killing so many people around the world. The United States, of course, is doing the same. They replicate whatever Israel does because according to the Shah of Iran 60 years ago, he said publicly on an interview with one of the most important journalists in the United States about the influence of Israel in the United States. So we don't know for sure, or maybe we do. I don't know you. Who really influences the United States when it comes to foreign policy, but most importantly, domestic policy. The domestic policy of the United States right now is to jail people up for 10 years if they dare to protest peacefully on the matters that concern the people. No doubt that when there's looters destroying private property, sure, they have to be detained and arrested. But that's not the issue here. The issue here is that the people of the United States, all around the cities in the United States, Seattle, Washington, New York, protested by the thousands, tens of thousands, in order to find an answer to the United States explanations about and regarding the pandemic. But not only that, they found out that the policy of the president, it's not only him, but before him, since Dwight Eisenhower, was to obliterate any insurrections. He's applying the counterintelligence methods that he uses in Central and South America with its own people. This is not new. This is something that the FBI has done for many decades now, since the 60s, since the war in Vietnam. He's using also the foreign policy with his twin brother Boris Johnson in England to suppress all citizens' dissent, accusing them of terrorists, accusing them, according to his now new the voice of the president, saying that they found some Al-Qaeda and some Arabic influence. Be sure that they're going to mention Iran in the next few days, and they're going to try to involve Iran in the revolts of the people. They call revolts instead of saying people manifested peacefully towards the aggression of the United States when it comes to killing innocent people. They're not only kill black people in the United States, they kill whoever they deem white trash, people police, according to the police, they are a superior race, and the police in the United States and in England, they are superior, so nobody has any rights. It's what the police says is true, unless proven guilty, is pronounced innocent. But guess what? Over 400 years of policing by the United States white supremacist and racist government, despite the advances that we have gotten, the United States, England, Europe, North America, in technology, not in democracy. Democracy is one of the elements that let's take a look. Let's take a look to something, guys, that you need to remember. Because my father said, okay, if you don't read Plato, I'm gonna give you belt. So we say, okay, no belt, Dad, no belt. So, what is justice? In the United States, justice is to obliterate, like they did with the Occupy movement, through police, by police force. What happened then? They wanted to say, hey, stop usurping the natural rights of American citizens to be wealthy, to construct a life, to be free, to build a life, to have a job, a decent job, a well-paid job. Unions, all that. No. Well, you remember the 1930s and the 1940s, the unions have a lot of struggle, and before that, way before that, with the mining people and many other revolutions that were silenced by the Rockefellers before, at the same time that the Central American and South American countries were invaded by the capital of the United States and the opportunistic people that saw the opportunity to get into governments and to bribe those governments with little money in order for them to produce billions or millions of dollars at a time. Guatemala, 1954 with Arbenz, well, whatever. Honduras, Salvador, you name it. In the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. So what is justice? Why is it that the world looks for justice? What is it that the world is uprising everywhere? In England, in the United States, in Canada, Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton, some other cities protest against the abuse of the police force with minorities or with everybody, with anybody that gave them the chance to be cruel and including able to kill them, like it's the case of this woman that was thrown out at 23rd floor in Toronto just recently. The disappearance of First Nations peoples in Canada, Thunder Bay issues regarding cops and First Nations, etc. Okay, but what is justice? What is it that people are rising up for, and why is it that, according to President Trump, the best democracy in the world needs to obliterate them by force and call the governors of the states fools because they're not killing innocent people, because they're not abusing innocent people, because they're not jailing up them for 10 years with all due process according to the Patriot Act since September 11, 2001. So what is justice? For more than 2,300 years, we're going to see what justice is. This book says it this way. I'll change my reading glasses. Happens when you get a little old. Listen, this is Socrates speaking with Thrasymachus. Listen, then, he said, I proclaim that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. And now, why do you not praise me? And why is that? Because the paragraph says before. That I learn of others, I reply, is quite true, but that I am ungrateful I wholly deny. Money I have none. And therefore I pay in praise, which is all I have, and how ready I am to praise anyone who appears to me to speak well. You will very soon find out when you answer, for I expect that you will answer well. So Thrasymachus answers and he says, listen, then, he said, I proclaim that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger, and now why do you not praise me? But of course you won't. Let me first understand you, I replied. Justice, as you say, is the interest of the stronger. So it carries on like that, and then you find more talking about justice. He says, True, we say that the physician or arithmetician or grammarian has made a mistake, but this is only a way of speaking. For the fact is that neither the grammarian nor any other person of skill ever makes a mistake insofar as he is what his name implies. None of them err unless their skill fails them. And then they cease to be skilled artists. No artist or sage or ruler errs at the time when he is what his name implies, though he is commonly said to err, and I adopted the common mode of speaking. But to be perfectly accurate, since you are such a lover of accuracy, we should say that the ruler, insofar as he is the ruler, is unerring, and being unerring always commands that which is for his own interest, and the subject is required to execute his commands. And therefore, as I said at first and now repeat, justice is in the interest of the stronger, and the dialogue comes and the things goes on. But it's true. We vote for people that are not supposed to err. We vote for people that we are supposed to trust. We vote for people that are supposed to keep in mind whatever is in the interest of the stronger, or of the strong. In this case, it's the people. That's what democracy is supposed to be, the people for the people by the people. But in reality, the stronger then as now is the people that control the capital means of production. Charles Marx, sure. But not only that, is whoever produces the capital. We can see that with George Bush, we can see that with schools and bonds, we can see that happening all together. With happening today, with React today, and the World's Wheel project is the fact that even the pandemic is being controlled by plutocrats. When Noam Chomsky explains that the United States just recently wanted to produce the PPE necessary in order to attend the pandemic, it's personal protective equipment, coveralls, hands, gloves, and everything that is needed for a doctor, for a nurse, for a person, in order to attend people with the disease, infected by the disease, by the virus. The United States said, okay, give it to this company. This company took the production, but it says, okay, well, you know what? This is worthless. We're not going to make any money out of this. So they stopped producing the PPE necessary to attend the hospitals and all. In other words, because of the United States government believes that only private corporations are to have the control of all commodities and everything that needs to be produced in the United States, only private corporations have the authority to produce or not. In other words, because the private corporations didn't found utilities, earnings, profit as much as they planned, they stopped producing it. In other words, they didn't produce it, and they didn't let the government produce it, because the government don't produce anything nowadays. The government makes sure that everything that produces capital, in other words, wealth for the peoples, for the middle class, for the poor, for whatever, went away offshore in China and other places, Bangladesh, Korea, whatever, where they can save a lot of money and they can make a lot of profit when they sell their products in the countries they were supposed to be working for. Like a pair of sneakers that you bought last week, today or a week ago, yeah, it's $100, $120. Well, it costs $10 in China or Korea or whatever, even less than that. So when you associate what the meaning of Mr. Donald Trump and his twin brother in Britain is, or are, it's the same policy, which is a scarcity, ruthless scarcity, and how do they call it nowadays, for the poor and the middle class, where you are born with a debt of 8,000 sterling pounds in England, or maybe more, and the United States $48,000 to $50,000 because it has a debt of 21 trillion. But the point is, the plutocrats who are in power according to the Republic are the ones that dictate what justice is. We're talking about justice. We're talking about not only penal justice when it comes to cases that has to deal with crime, which are plenty in the United States. But we're talking about justice in every way: economic justice, justice in freedom, justice in way of thinking, justice of thought, justice of believing, justice of whatever. Justice means a lot of stuff and covers all aspects of humanity. That's what democracies are. But according to Donald Trump, the democracy that he's actually producing for the people, his people, that not the majority of people in the United States, the absence of voters is enormous. But the people that elected Mr. Trump, with the promise that he will stop wars in Middle East and all that lies, that he will bring the boys back home, is total lie. But what he's applying right now is the policies of foreign policy of the United States, guided of course by Israel, because Israel has everything to do with foreign policy. That's another chapter that we need to talk about. And it's not me saying it, it's Naomi Klein saying it, it's not Chomsky saying it, it's Norman Filkenstein saying it, all those guys being rejected by the mainstream media, because not only they are Jewish, but because they are saying that to the Jewish people and to the rest of the world, and they are considered to be some of the most important and intellectual in journalism and investigative research around the world, even though there's way many more than them. But we have to recognize that Noam Chomsky, Norman Filkenstein, and Naomi Klein are Jewish people that are representing the rest of the world, because they know what they are talking about, and we, citizens of the United States, Canada, and the rest of the world, know what is going on, because we are living in this planet. We know what is being to be laid off. We know how to be in poverty when we cannot afford our houses anymore. We know what it is to go to Vancouver to buy housing. We cannot, because there's Chinese and there's British and there's everything, and the rise of the rent and the rise of the housing goes up because of few people buying lots of stuff that they don't inhabit. England, London, for example, there's a lot in London City, the city of London, a lot of market for foreign buyers. They can buy apartments for $70 million. Who's going to compete with that? A guy that uses his hands to make a living, the nurse that goes to the hospital, maybe the worker on concrete or something like that. No, they can barely live with whatever sterling pounds they can live. They have no prospect for better education. They have no prospects to advance in their education, because everything is very expensive, especially education. The same in the United States, and we call that democracy.
The competitive market between universities, which the system of variable tuition fees envisaged, has simply not emerged. All but a handful of universities charge the maximum possible fees for undergraduate courses. 3-year courses remain the norm, and the level of fees charged do not relate to the cost or quality of the course. So we now have one of the most expensive systems of university tuition in the world. Shifting the whole burden of university tuition onto the shoulders of taxpayers as a whole would have 3 consequences. First, it would inevitably mean tax increases for the majority of people who did not go to university and who on average earn less than those who did. Second, it would mean our universities competing with schools and hospitals for scarce resources, which in the past meant they lost out, putting their international preeminence at risk. And third, it would mean the necessary reintroduction of a cap on numbers, with the Treasury regulating the number of places an institution could offer and preventing the expansion which has driven wider access in recent years. And that is not my idea of a fair or progressive system. There are many aspects of the current system which work well. Universities in England are now better funded than they have been for a generation. And sharing the cost of university between taxpayers as a whole and the graduates who directly benefit from university study is a fair principle. It's enabled us to lift the cap on the number of places, which was in effect a cap on aspiration, so universities can expand and so broaden access.
No, that is plutocracy. I think there's a book written by, which is now Foreign Ministry for the Canadian government. She wrote a book a few years ago in 2014, I believe it was, It's called Plutocrats, the rise of the rich and the fall of everyone else. And now she has an important administrative position in the Justin Trudeau's government, Foreign Ministry or Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But the reality is that Mr. Trump is applying the policies of foreign policy. That means oppression, killing, assassinations, drones like Obama, but a little further. Even though he's promised to find out what are the realities of the working class of America, the economy in the United States is not balanced, but it's working. But that is because the majority of people are getting jobs with minimum wage, and their contracts are not life contracts. Actually, the contracts that they get are not stable. Industry is falling apart. The infrastructure is falling apart in the United States. Is the developed country. Okay, of the developed countries of the world, is the country that lives like a third world country, because it doesn't invest in infrastructure, doesn't invest in education, doesn't invest in possibilities for its people. It's not only a racist country for more than 400 years, it's a military police state. To the point that they say fools to the governors because they don't stop the normal, legal, constitutional right of the peoples to go to the streets and say, hey, what's going on with our government? No. They send the police, armed police, to spare gases on them, hit them violently, and they love it. The police love it to do that. They do. The police in the United States have a history of abuse for more than 100 years, but especially since the civil rights movements began. So they love what they do. They love to oppress, they love to hit people, and as is proven, America kills people, innocent people, unarmed people, by the hundreds every year, if not thousands. I'm not sure about those numbers, but I will find out. What happened with Mr. Floyd was the tip that produces the change in balance of the Statue of Liberty, or that is presented in the courthouses, and about justice that is blind. Well, it's very blind. Injustice cannot be blind. The explanation for the blindness of the Statue of Justice is that it has to be impartial, that doesn't go from one side or the other, but it's just fair. Well, don't say that about, these guys that who I'm talking about. The point is, peoples around the world are protesting. Here in Canada, the protests in Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto are big, because of the abuses of the police. When you become a police or a soldier, when I was a soldier, I said, okay, I'm going to defend my country. I'm going to do whatever against the guerrillas, and I was convinced of that. But then I knew and I found out that we were trying to kill innocent people. And it's still happening in Colombia. That's a different story. And it's a democratic country. Okay, it's not. It's a tyranny there. It's a tyranny. Colombia is a tyranny. Period. Central and South America, look at Ecuador, look at all those countries where the influence of the Jewish people are there. I'm not talking about the Jewish people, but I do, because when they vote for the same prime minister over and over and over again, 5 times for Mr. Netanyahu, and what does Netanyahu does? Look what he's doing with Palestinians.
What I heard day after day, everywhere I went, I was walking through a real-life horror film, and this was the Palestinian experience in Gaza for 51 days. It was like a sequel to the movie Saw. How do you deal with that psychologically? That's the question we have to ask now, because the humanitarian situation is worse than it's ever been in history. The United Nations Relief Works Agency predicted that Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020, and it's currently uninhabitable. People are trapped there, most can't leave. And who are the Jewish Israelis, the 300,000 who participated in this operation? How do they think? Netanyahu was reelected, and a surprise to a lot of Americans, after Operation Protective Edge. You have to go into a very right-wing, eliminationist mindset in order to justify what you did, and it's Netanyahu is able to cater to that. Just the amount of violence I witnessed was only the beginning of a nightmare that's continuing through the present. The Gaza Strip has 80% of the residents of the Gaza Strip, 72 to 80% are refugees. So it's a warehouse for surplus humans. And for the first time, you actually are seeing, for example, a wave of child suicides. I interviewed the father of Salam Shamali, who was killed on camera.
Guys, this one.
In the hand.
He was looking for his wounded cousin, and he was killed. It was reported on by international news, and the family, it really affected the family to find out, our son was killed, and we found out because someone emailed us the video of his killing, and we only knew it was him because we recognized the sound of his screams. So Salam's father told me that his other sons and children are making amanat, which is a unique term that doesn't really have a clear English translation, but it means like their last dying wishes. So the violence, of course, is on, it's a physical violence, but there's a psychological component to it. The Israelis threatened to bomb the main hospital, the Al-Najjar hospital in Rafah, and so everyone had to pour out of the hospital, wounded people missing limbs, and the entire medical staff, and the only place left was the Kuwaiti hospital, which is actually a 20-bed OBGYN and geriatric clinic in the center of town that's completely unequipped for this kind of disaster. And the doctor I met there, Samir Holmes, told me that he was treating amputees on the floor, that his own medical staff was coming in dead, and that the carnage got so bad that he had to order ice cream coolers from local shops to store the corpses of infants. And this image that is widely available of 4 infants in white death shrouds in an ice cream cooler, I think is iconic. It's the image that distills the entire sensibility of Israeli society at this point and how little value they place on Palestinian life.
Okay. Yeah. Another apartheid and killing people from 600 feet away, just shooting them in the legs so they can never walk again with expansive bullets. Okay, that's another issue we have to deal with.
A shoot to cripple policy, and he provided me with documentation which pretty much showed that soldiers were cracking down on demonstrations with live fire to the legs. Not only that, but some of the bullets were what Palestinians call ton-ton bullets or dum-dum bullets, which are expanding rounds. So they'll bounce around inside your limbs and expand and really cripple you for life. The Israeli, this bill to jail stone throwers for 20 years complements another measure put into place by the Israeli military and police, which allows even members of the Israeli police to shoot demonstrators with 22 caliber rounds from Ruger rifles. The 22 caliber rounds are less likely to kill, they're more likely to cripple, they shatter bones, they often bounce around inside your body. This is standard practice now. It's standard practice to shoot demonstrators with live weapons.
The Palestinians, unfortunately, instead of building a Gaza Strip as the Singapore of the Middle East, they choose the terror path.
They want to pile up as many civilian dead as they can because somebody said they use, I mean, it's gruesome, they use telegenically dead Palestinians for their cause. They want the more dead, the better.
In the letter, and I'll read it to you, you say the formerly populated areas will be shelled in Gaza with maximum firepower. The entire civilian and military infrastructure of Hamas will be destroyed entirely. And then you say those who insist on staying will be required to publicly sign a declaration of loyalty to Israel.
People might be surprised to learn that Netanyahu is actually not the most right-wing in the Israeli government, that it's actually just gotten more and more right-wing over the last decade.
Benjamin Netanyahu, I've been saying for the last 2 years, exists at the hollow center of Israeli politics. I talked about the generation of Palestinian youth, the post-Oslo generation, and how they've developed, but within Israeli society there's been a parallel development with the post-Oslo generation that's extremely radical, sees no hope for a two-state solution or a peace process. Their approach to the Palestinians is that there's no partner for peace and that they only understand force. This is a generation that's adopted a very strongly Jewish identity and a belligerent Jewish identity, as opposed to the identity of Israel's founding generation, which was based around a concept of Israeli nationalism, which was racist, but which allowed for some place for Palestinians or Arabs.
They have broken all the commandments of the United Nations security team. Nothing happens to them. And where are they present? Look at Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, like United States, believe in extractive economies, that is, against photosynthesis. Who in his right mind as a politician, as a leader of state, goes against photosynthesis? The Brazilian president, the Colombian president, the Ecuadorian president, the North American president, and the European presidents. They go there and let's destroy the world. That's democracy. People are sick of it. What tilted the balance of power here between democracy, which is a word that is used, misused and abused, and is never existed, according to Plato, and that's 2,300 years ago, is that, yes, justice or democracy is what the power decides to be. And the power is not the people, the power is not us, the power is the plutocrats, the people that produces the money that controls the production, the means of production. We have to be extractive, even though we don't need oil or gas for more than 100 years. According to Nikola Tesla, that has been proven by another book that I would like you to read, Compromise. This guy, this author, Eugene Malov, was killed, assassinated, and many others that have produced new ways of thinking in the United States, persecuted by the FBI, barraged by the FBI. They take their computers, they take their machines, they take everything away, and you don't hear anything about it. Most of them, some of them, have been poisoned, etc., etc., etc. The End Machine by Brian De Palma, the brother of Bruce De Palma, sorry, correct here, the brother of Brian De Palma, the producer of this famous movie, Scarface and everything. He invented a machine that produces electricity, and that produces more electricity in the output than it needs in the input. So there's plenty of inventions that we have been deprived from for more than a century. And who does that? The plutocrats, the people in power that want to protect their sources of wealth. So Israel in Chile, which is a reactionary government. Oppression, Pinochet style. You remember that Pinochet was, of course, the toy boy for Mr. Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, whatever. Yeah, a Jewish pro-Israel Zionist advisor for the campaigns against Vietnam, also with Mr. McNamara. Yeah, okay. Jewish in Chile, Jewish in Brazil, Jewish in Colombia, and everywhere, Ecuador. Okay. And who are the best pals of the Jewish people? The Americans. Who are the best pals of the Saudi Arabians that decapitate people, castrate people, put people in prison? The Americans. And what did the United States say about the protesters? Hundreds of thousands of people. Just like Nixon did, putting buses in front of the White House, he did with buses and now has a fence. And turn off the light of the White House. He felt afraid by us, the people, the real democracy, the real Zulu, as they call it, el verdadero Zulu. Okay, when you see these things happening, you cannot just keep quiet and say nothing about it. And here in Canada, which is, I think, still the best country in the world, and should give an example of democracy. But before the pandemic, you have to remember that the governor of Alberta, for example, in Alberta, is firing thousands of people of healthcare, thousands of people with the education system, thousands of people were being fired with no compensation whatsoever. If they have a compensation, it's not going to fit the debt that the Canadian people have. Exactly. So the American ways are trying to step into Canada. I hope that Mr. Trudeau don't permit that. This pandemic has proven that. Canada has survived. Finland has survived. Switzerland has survived. Norway has survived. Their economies. And people have been saved from bankruptcy. Restaurants, citizens, street people have received government budget on these matters. Dentists, whomever, we have received in Canada, in Switzerland, in Norway, in Holland, vast amounts of money. There are, of course, necessary in order to produce wealth and to keep the wealth running. Let's start with Canada. Canada is the example of the world, and it can be the example of the world way further than the United States. We don't want to be the United States. Forget about it. We are associates of the United States. Canada has a lot, is the main partner when it comes to trade and commerce, sure, but we don't want to be the United States. We don't want a Trump in here. Forget about it. We want elected. Wait, unless there's fraud, which is pretty common in the United States, when there's only two parties, and the leader of one of the two parties gave up all of a sudden, without any fight, without resistance, gave up the will of the people who was put in confidence on him. And he betrayed it. He betrayed us all because we liked him here in Canada and all around the world. All around the world, people were talking about Bernie Sanders. All around the world, America once again is going to, after 200 years, is going to make it, man. Finally! Well, no, he betrayed us all. And of course, the American voter, for the second time, he could have run as an independent and he could have won, period. But no, he decided to betray the nation for the second time with excuses and words and all that crap that he's saying in the mainstream media, and he's not speaking that much lately. And he will appear here and there, but he betrayed the United States' illusion and only hope to stop Donald Trump. And the next president, which is nothing different than Donald Trump, is a little more wiser and a little more smarter, but he is a plutocrat. And with his history, you can see him for the war against Iraq, etc. Getting back to the point with the COVID-19 and the protesters in the United States and his twin brother in England and the United Kingdom, is to arrest, and he, in his words, for 10 years or more. If it was for him, he will kill them all. That is the kind of sociopath and maniac that the United States has as president. Okay, but how do we get to this point? I don't know, guys, but you need to read a little bit, you know. Even I, that I'm not an intellectual or something, well, I'm invited to those circles, thank you guys. But, yeah. Let's read a little bit of some important inspirator for what democracy is all about. I'm not saying that is the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but it is at this moment and right now. And this is just one of the authors I would like to mention, like Plato. Okay, she says, a more accurate term for a system that erases the boundaries between big government and big business is not liberal, conservative, or capitalist, but corporatist. Its main characteristics are huge transfers of public wealth to private hands, often accompanied by exploding debt, an ever-widening chasm between the dazzling rich and the disposable poor, and an aggressive nationalism that justifies bottomless spending on security. For those inside the bubble of extreme wealth created by such an arrangement, there can be no more profitable way to organize a society. But because of the obvious drawbacks for the vast majority of the population left outside the bubble, other features of the corporatist state tend to include aggressive surveillance, once again with government and large corporations trading favors and contracts, mass incarceration, shrinking civil liberties, and often, though not always, torture. But let's get a little bit further. From Chile to China to Iraq, torture has been a silent partner in the global free market crusade. But torture is more than a tool used to enforce unwanted policies on rebellious peoples. It is also a metaphor of the shock doctrine's underlying logic. Torture, or in CIA language, I quote, coercive interrogation, unquote, is a set of techniques designed to put prisoners into a state of deep disorientation and shock in order to force them to make concessions against their will. The guiding logic is elaborated in two CIA manuals that were declassified in the late 90s. They explain that the way to break, I quote, resistant sources, unquote, is to create violent ruptures between prisoners and their ability to make sense of the world around them. First, the senses are starved of any input with hoods, earplugs, shackles, total isolation. Then the body is bombarded with overwhelming stimulation, strobe lights, blaring music, beatings, electroshocks. The goal of this softening up, quote unquote, stage is to provoke a kind of hurricane in the mind. Prisoners are so regressed and afraid that they can no longer think rationally or protect their own interests. It is in that state of shock that most prisoners give their interrogators whatever they want: information, confessions, a renunciation of former beliefs. One CIA manual provides a particular succinct explanation. I quote, "There is an interval which may be extremely brief of suspended animation, a kind of psychological shock of paralysis. It is caused by a traumatic or sub-traumatic experience which explodes, as it were. The world that is familiar to the subject as well as his image of himself within that world is gone. Experienced interrogators recognize this effect when it appears and know that at this moment the source is far more open to suggestion, far likelier to comply than he was just before he experienced the shock," unquote. Why do I mention this? Because they're using the same tactics with masses, according to the author. The shock doctrine mimics this process, precisely attempting to achieve on a mass scale what torture does one-on-one in the interrogation cell. The clearest example was the shock of September 11, which for millions of people exploded, quote, "the world that is familiar," unquote, and opened up a period of disorientation and regression that the Bush administration expertly exploited, as we mentioned with the one-on-one with the CIA torture proceedings. It happens with 9/11 collectively. Bush administration expertly exploded. Suddenly we found ourselves living in a kind of year zero, in which everything we knew of the world in which everything we knew of the world before could now be dismissed as pre-9/11 thinking. So one was the world before 9/11 and now it's a different world after 9/11. That's the shock and awe that these people want to cause on us, like the tortures on the CIA one-on-one. Never strong in our knowledge of history, I repeat, never strong in our knowledge of history, North Americans have become a blank slate, I quote, a clean sheet of paper, unquote, on which, I quote, the newest and most beautiful words can be written, unquote. As Mao said of his people. She mentioned here Mao, but there's many others in the United States and whatever. Yeah, but Mao, of course. A new army of experts after 9/11 instantly materialized to write new and beautiful words on the receptive canvas of our post-trauma consciousness. And they call it class of civilizations, they inscribed. They inscribed also in this clean sheet that is our minds, axis of evil, Islamophacism or fascism, homeland security. With everyone preoccupied by the deadly new culture wars, the Bush administration was able to pull off what it could only have dreamed of doing before 9/11. And this is wage privatized wars abroad and build a corporate security complex at home. That is how the shock doctrine works. The original disaster, the coup, the terrorist attack, the market meltdown, the war, the tsunami, the hurricane, Katrina for example in 2005, and of course now the pandemic is not here, but this is 2007. That's how the shock doctrine works. The original disaster, the coup, the terrorist attack, the market meltdown, the war, the tsunami, the hurricane, the pandemic, puts the entire population into a state of collective shock. The falling bombs, the bursts of terror, the pounding winds serve to soften up whole societies much as the blaring music and blows in the torture cells soften up prisoners. Like the terrorized prisoners who gives up the names of comrades and renounces his faith, shocked societies often give up things they would otherwise fiercely protect. After 9/11, you can capture people, send them without trial to prisons, Guantanamo Bay, send them overseas. You can kill and disappear everybody with due process or take them in prison for as long as you want. If that is not giving up your rights that you were before will fight fiercely for, I don't know how else can I explain that to you. So pay attention to what is happening. Jamar Perry and his fellow evacuees at the Baton Rouge shelter were supposed to give up their housing projects and public schools. After the tsunami, the fishing people in Sri Lanka were supposed to give up their valuable beachfront land to hoteliers. Iraqis, if all had gone according to plan, were supposed to be so shocked and awed that they would give up control of their oil reserves, their state companies, and their sovereignty to United States military bases and green zones. I can carry on, and this is just the beginning of the book. When you go up here, for example, erasing Iraq, she mentions, in search of a model for the Middle East, model, quote unquote, she speaks, the introverted, schizophrenic, or melancholic may be linked to a walled city which has closed its gates and refuses to trade with the rest of the world. A breach is blown in the wall and relations with the world are re-established. Unfortunately, we cannot control the amount of damage done in the bombardment. These are words of Andrew M. Willey, a British psychiatrist on electroshock therapy in the 1940s. Okay, but in a post-September 11 world, I thought the prudent use of violence could be therapeutic. In a post-September 11 world, I thought the prudent use of violence could be therapeutic. This is in the hands of the people we are in. We, the world, we, the people, are in the hands of these demented idiots. This is Richard Cohen, the one that said, in a post-September 11 world, I thought the prudent use of violence could be therapeutic. Richard Cohen, a Washington Post columnist, on his support for the invasion of Iraq. Okay. This is monstrous. This is scandalous. This is literally the war between good and evil, guys. So if you believe in a God, or you're an atheist or whatever your circumstances, in the nation you were born, geographically, whatever, listen, guy, you need to understand that we're in the hands of demented people, and the Plutocrats are those demented people, and they are in control of the banking system, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, and of course, the 5 countries that have the Security Council are the 5 countries that produce more weapons in the world, so they're not going to be for easing this situation up, guys. There's much to talk about, and I will take, I don't know, a whole book to write with some process right now. But we need to think about this, especially in Canada, and we have to understand that we can live and erase poverty, not by the GMOs, as they promised 40 years ago. Even the second part of the movie, The Prophecy, spoke about it as the opening of the Antichrist in the movie. But in reality, things are not different. We are in the hands of psychopaths, maniacs, bankers, everywhere in the world. And the responsibles of those are the elites of every country, but not only that. These elites of every country in the world obey and pushed by and support the policies of the elites around the world as foreign policy. In other words, we are in the hands of evil people that do not care about you or I, that their minds are so distant to ours that they don't consider us to be their peers or humans or anything like that. This is a very dangerous position. I invite you to think about it and react today about it. For us, for the country, for the world. I hope to see you next time in the next edition of React Today. Au revoir. Bye-bye. Hasta pronto.